Greetings. I'm here doing a trailer. I'm trying to introduce in this trailer 14 episodes that I've done about the famous Wilson Dynapower line of wedges. These are the wedges made between 56 and 75. I think they're actually better than modern wedges that are available in the store because they are heavier. I think heavier is better. I'll explain why. It's probably intuitive to you that you can use a shorter backswing, and that would be a backswing with better control for your shots. I think the wedges that are heavier are better for your so-called out-of-position shots where you're somewhat near the green. You don't need a full swing into the green. You've already swung and you've missed the green. You're in the rough. You're left, you're right, you're long, you're short, you're in the sand. You're somewhere around the green. I think that heavier is better for that. And I think the other major point that I'll argue is that you need to carry two sand wedges in your bag. One with low bounce, the other is high bounce. Maybe some of you aren't familiar with the concept of bounce, although it's become more and more important over the last 20 years. And now the club makers are finally stamping right on the club the amount of bounce that it has. But they didn't used to do that. And unfortunately, these Wilson staff wedges that were used, that dominated the tour, and I want to talk about how Wilson did dominate the tour. They don't reflect the bounce, they don't reflect the swing weight, they don't even reflect the loft. So you really need to know, you need to use the stampings on the club to figure out what year they're from, and then go from there with the assistance of these videos to figure out bounce and swing weight information that's not available anywhere else. The reason I can tell you about it is because I've got a collection of 40 or 50 of these wedges, and empirically I've measured bounce and I've measured swing weight, and I can tell you about what I've learned. In a systematic way, this series will proceed through model cycle by model cycle. The wedges made between 56 and 75. They're made in 1, 2, or 3 year model cycles, and I will show you the wedges and the stampings, and then I'll talk about the bounce and about the swing weight that these clubs had. Now, I want to go back to Wilson Company and why you should even think about Wilson. You may think, well, they aren't very famous right now. They're not nearly as famous as the big club companies like TaylorMade and Callaway, and but there was a time between the 1950s and the 1990s where Wilson absolutely dominated the Pro Tour. They probably made some marketing mistakes, but even putting that aside, big companies with huge advertising budgets jumped in and hired a lot of pros to do their marketing, and Wilson, based in Chicago, I think could not compete with those payouts. Wilson still makes great clubs, it's just that they aren't as famous. But Wilson did win, pros won. Carrying Wilson clubs, they won 62 majors, probably more. I'm sure that that's more than any other club company. Their wedges and forge clubs dominated the tours between the 50s and the turn of the century. And their wedges, I think, are the model for the modern wedges. This 1958, which I will bring up again, it's this shape that appears over and over. Bob Vokey uses this shape. Cleveland, I think, makes no attempt to hide the fact that its wedges are based on this 1958 Wilson staff sand wedge. Again, this is one that's been refurbished. It is one where it was so heavily used and adored by its owner that you can't even read the word sand wedge as they appear on the sole anymore. I want to show you, I want to give a little content to the term bounce. If you look at it, you will see that the back edge of the sole goes up from the leading edge, and it's that back edge that provides the bounce off the turf or off the sand, and fends off the natural digging into the club, digging into either the sand or digging into the turf. The bounce prevents or inhibits that digging in. Conversely, low bounce, where there isn't much of a flange on the back, allows more digging in. And for example, when you have hard turf, you don't need to worry so much about digging in, and a low bounce wedge allows you to make cleaner contact without any interference with the turf. It allows a cleaner strike. So I argue in favor of heavy wedges. The other point I argue is that you need to carry two wedges in your bag, two sand wedges, one high bounce, one low bounce, because of the inverse or converse relationship between sand and turf. And what I mean by that is that when it's wet outside, been raining a lot, you have soggy turf where the club will tend to dig, and so you need high bounce to fend off that digging, or else if you dig too much, you're going to chunk the shot and it's not going to go anywhere. So you want a high bounce wedge for the turf when it's wet. Conversely, when it's wet and you're in the sand, you want a low bounce wedge because the sand is probably packed harder. It's wet. It's not fluffy, so you need a lower bounce wedge for that situation under the same weather conditions. Then the converse is true when you've got dry conditions. When it's a dry fairway, you want a low bounce wedge to make cleaner contact, and you don't need to worry so much about digging. But when you're in the sand and it's dry, you're going to have fluffy sand, and the club is going to tend to dig, and it'll dig too much. And if you aren't careful, you're going to chunk the shot. The club will just go into the turf and it won't make good contact, or maybe not even any contact with the ball. You won't move the ball. So you need big bounce in the sand when you've got fluffy sand from dry conditions. So I'm advocating here that you carry two heavy wedges, two heavy sand wedges. And during the 14 episodes, I will go through the various model years. I'm not going to advocate that you wait until eBay presents you with an opportunity to buy a 1958 like this one, because you just aren't going to find that. You're going to need to move on and buy a dynapowered wedge from maybe the mid-1960s, or early 1970s. That'll be much more accessible to you in terms of price, in terms of the frequency that the club appears up for auction. So this series of videos, it's gonna altogether the 14 videos run about 3 hours, about the time it would take you to play 9 holes of golf. And I would suggest to you that you're going to benefit a whole lot more from watching these videos than you would in terms of the practice obtained by playing 9 holes of golf. Maybe you enjoy playing 9 holes of golf more than you enjoy watching me. And I assume that's probably true. But I think you'll learn a lot more by watching these videos. I think it'll help you with your out of position game. And again, I think your sand wedges are the third most used club. I bet you probably use it 10, 12, 13 times around, whether or not you're in the sand. If you're in the rough, anytime you're around the green but have missed the green, you're probably going to be turning to your sand wedge or some other wedge. I'm going to talk about the 4 types of wedges that Wilson made during the during these years. They put out 4 wedges every year. They put out a pitching wedge, a dual wedge, a triple duty wedge, and a sand wedge. And those have different bounce on them. Effectively, the dual wedge can be your low bounce sand wedge. The triple duty can be your low bounce sand wedge. Those are both 53 degrees. And then your pitching wedge from those years is at 51. That's essentially your modern gap wedge. Nowadays, the pitching wedges are 47, 48, even as low as 46. But back then, what they called a pitching wedge back then is about 51 degrees of loft, with typically very low bounce, by the way, which makes them better for chipping, because the gap wedges you have now have 8 degrees of bounce, and that doesn't necessarily give you a clean strike on the ball. You've got turf interfering, and maybe even if you've got a tight lie, you've even got trouble getting the club underneath. So there are just a lot of advantages to looking seriously at these old Wilson wedges and becoming familiar with them, and they're not terribly expensive. And then I'm going to tell you how to actually go about winning an auction on eBay, what you need to look for. You may need to ask questions to ensure that you're not buying a damaged club, one with a bent shaft or a dented shaft. You don't want that. You know, what are the modest refurbishments, if you will, that can be done. You can put on a new grip, for example. You can strip off rust without too much trouble. You know, you can make cosmetic improvements so that your buddies on the tee box don't laugh at you for carrying around some really ugly, heavily rusted and damaged wedge. So I'll tell you how to go about that. I'll tell you how to make those refurbishments work for you, so that you've got a club that you're not ashamed of. I get ribbed about my old clubs, and I don't mind it, but I've been told that I'd be a pretty good golfer if I'd get myself a decent set of clubs. So that's the purpose here. I just think it's good to know about these world beater wedges that Wilson made, and I don't want the data to be lost to history. So go ahead and subscribe. I'll be releasing 3 of these videos soon. They've already been recorded, and then I'll release another 2 or 3, and then another 2 or 3, and so if you're subscribed, I think you'd get notification. I'm under my handle, if you will, is 1958dynapoweredwedgeguy. 1958dynapoweredwedgeguy. And that's where you'll find this series of videos. So I invite you to tune in, and I hope you enjoy it. And I know that I've enjoyed making them, and I feel better knowing that the information is out there for posterity. Thanks a lot.